Okay, so let's unpack this. There are these questions, right? Questions that sit right at the very edge of what we understand.
Yeah.
Things that touch on, well, what it means to be alive, what it means to be you. And today, we're diving into maybe the biggest one, the enigma of consciousness. We're going to explore why it's just a profound puzzle and look at how different fields, science, philosophy, even ancient spiritual traditions try to get their heads around it. We've pulled together a pretty fascinating stack of sources for, articles, research, even some old philosophical texts to guide us.
Yeah, what's really fascinating, I think, is just how stubborn this question is. I mean, centuries of investigation, right?
Okay.
And it's still tricky. It's not just a scientific puzzle. It's philosophical. It's even intensely personal. It really touches on that fundamental link between, our inner world and the reality out there. We kind of take our own subjective experience for granted most of the time, but explaining why we even have it, that's arguably the biggest challenge out there for understanding the universe.
That's a really powerful way to put it. So, okay, diving in then. Let's start with a concept that really sharpened the focus on this mystery. David Chalmers' hard problem of consciousness.
Oh.
Now, Chalmers wasn't saying the, quote, easy problems are actually, easy to solve in the lab. Not at all. He meant they're easy conceptually.
Yeah.
Because they're about explaining functions, structures, like how the brain processes information or how it focuses attention, how we remember stuff. These are incredibly complex, sure, but we can kind of see in theory how we might map out the mechanisms. We can figure out the how. But here's the kicker, the really interesting part. The hard problem. That's explaining why and how all this physical stuff happening in the brain comes with subjective experience. It boils down to that question. Why does all this processing feel like anything from the inside?
Exactly. And right at the heart of that hard problem is this thing philosophers call qualia, plural. Qual is singular. Think of them as the unique private qualities of your experience, like the vibrant redness of a ripe tomato. You know that red?
Right.
Or the sharp stinging feeling of pain.
Or the smell of coffee brewing.
Exactly. These aren't just objective facts about wavelengths or nerve signals. They're the what it's like aspects, your inner world. The philosopher Thomas Nagel, he wrote this famous essay, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And he argued pretty convincingly that even if we knew everything about a bat's brain, its sonar, its biology, we still wouldn't know what it truly feels like to be that bat, navigating by sound. And this leads to what Joseph Levine called the explanatory gap. Imagine, you have a perfect manual for building a car. Every single part, every wire, every connection.
Okay.
But that manual cannot tell you what it feels like to hit the accelerator, to feel the wind.
I see.
That's the gap. We've got the physical how-to for the brain, seemingly, but we're missing the what it's like for consciousness. And a really kind of mind-bending idea here is the philosophical zombie. Imagine a being, okay, physically identical to you, behaves exactly like you, says the same things, but there's nothing going on inside. No inner experience, no lights on upstairs, so to speak. If you can even coherently imagine such a being, a P-zombie, it suggests that consciousness might be something extra, a further fact beyond just the physical arrangement of stuff.
Wow, a philosophical zombie.
Yeah.
Like a perfect replica, but empty. That definitely messes with your head. Okay, so speaking of things that challenge our view of reality, let's pivot a bit. Let's jump into a scientific area that often gets mistakenly tangled up with these philosophical puzzles, the quantum world. You've probably heard people talk about the observer effect in physics, right? But what does it actually mean? And how does it connect, or maybe more importantly, not connect, to consciousness?
Yeah, that's a really crucial distinction to make because the language gets confusing. I mean, even in our everyday world, measuring something often changes it, right? Check your tire pressure. A tiny bit of air escapes. Simple. But down at the quantum level, this isn't just a side effect, it's fundamental. Particles, they don't really have definite properties like position or momentum until they're measured, or rather, until they interact with something. This is the core of the measurement problem. Before interaction, particles exist in a kind of haze of possibilities, a superposition. Then, boom, upon interaction, they seem to pick a definite state. The classic example, everyone's heard of it, is the double slit experiment.
Right, with the electrons.
Exactly. Electrons act like spread out waves when you're not watching which slit they go through. But if you put a detector there to see which slit they use, they suddenly act like tiny, localized particles.
So it's almost like the universe is waiting for something to, look at it before it makes up its mind.
Kind of, yeah. Or rather, until it interacts with its environment. And this is the key part where the popular idea about consciousness gets it wrong. The observer in quantum mechanics, Doesn't need to be a conscious human being looking at it. A Geiger counter clicking. A photographic plate getting exposed. Even just, an air molecule bumping into the quantum system.
Ah, okay.
Any interaction can basically force it out of that fuzzy quantum state. Think about it this way. Quantum states are incredibly fragile, delicate. So even tiny interactions with the surroundings, physicists call this decoherence, make them rapidly lose their quantum weirdness and start looking like the classical world we know. So decoherence reframes the question. It's less about what magical thing causes collapse and more about why we perceive only one outcome from this huge cloud of quantum possibilities. The really crucial point for our discussion here is that this idea that a conscious mind is needed to cause quantum collapse, sometimes called quantum mysticism, it's overwhelmingly not supported by mainstream physics. The observer is just any interaction. Conscious, unconscious, doesn't matter.
Okay, that is a huge clarification. Very important. Thank you. So we've got the hard problem, this persistent explanatory gap. We've busted some quantum myths. But if that gap between the physical brain and subjective feeling remains, how have philosophers actually tried to, build a bridge? Because faced with this challenge, thinkers have come up with some profoundly different ways of looking at reality, mind, matter. Let's quickly walk through maybe the four main philosophical camps here.
Right. And these different frameworks, they really try to tackle the hard problem head on, either trying to solve it or dissolve it, or maybe just redefine what the problem even is. Okay, first up, materialism, right? Sometimes called physicalism, same basic idea. The core belief. Reality is fundamentally physical. That's it, full stop. So consciousness, from this view, has got to be just a product of complex brain activity, nothing more. For a materialist, consciousness might be, maybe an illusion, like Dennett suggests with his user illusion idea, or maybe it's just a conceptual confusion we have, or the big hope is future neuroscience will eventually explain it fully, show how it emerges from brain stuff, or reduces to it. This is often called promissory materialism, basically, a promise that science will find the physical answer, even if we don't have it right now.
So materialism is kind of saying, hold tight, science is on the case.
Yeah.
But, speaking for myself, experiencing, say, the color blue right now, it feels really hard to imagine how a bunch of neurons firing could be this feeling. Does it really bridge that subjective gap for you?
And that is exactly the hard problem of materialism. You've hit the nail on the head. It's great at explaining the functions of the brain, the how, but it really struggles with that raw first-person feeling of being you, the what it's like. So yeah, it often feels like it just kicks the can down the road. The hard problem remains hard, especially for materialism. That's a key takeaway. Okay, next camp, dualism. This view argues that nope, mind and matter are fundamentally different kinds of stuff. Or properties. You've got substance dualism, which most people connect with Descartes. Two distinct substances. Physical stuff, body, and non-physical stuff, mind, soul. Consciousness is a feature of that non-physical mind stuff. Then there's property dualism. David Chalmers leans this way. It says there's only one kind of substance, physical stuff, but it has two fundamentally different kinds of properties.
Yeah.
Physical properties, like mass, charge, and non-physical phenomenal properties, like the feeling of blueness. So consciousness here is seen as a fundamental non-physical property of certain physical systems, like brains, maybe governed by unknown psychophysical laws.
Okay, so mind and body, or mental properties and physical properties, are distinct.
Mm-hmm.
But then, how do they talk to each other? That seems like the big question.
Yeah.
If my mind, or this mental property, is non-physical, how does it actually make my physical arm reach for that coffee cup? Or how does stubbing my physical toe create a non-physical feeling of pain?
Bingo. That's the classic and arguably the biggest challenge for dualism, the interaction problem.
Mm-hmm.
If they're truly different categories of existence, how can the non-physical causally influence the physical without messing up fundamental physical laws, like the conservation of energy? It's a huge puzzle. Some dualists try to get around this with something called epiphenomenalism. The idea there is that consciousness is just a byproduct. It's caused by the brain, but it doesn't cause anything itself.
Like steam from a train.
Exactly like steam from a train. It's there, but it doesn't make the train move. But that feels pretty weird, right? It makes our conscious feelings, our decisions, our joys, our sorrows completely powerless, which intuitively feels like a high price to pay. Okay, third view, panpsychism. This one's been getting a lot more attention recently. It suggests that consciousness, or maybe some incredibly basic, primitive form of it, like proto-consciousness, isn't just in brains. It suggests it's a fundamental and ubiquitous property of matter itself, like everywhere, all the way down to the most basic particles, quarks, electrons, whatever the fundamental building blocks turn out to be.
Whoa, okay, so wait, does that mean my desk lamp is conscious?
Ha! No, not like you and me. Doesn't mean your lamp is having deep thoughts. The idea is more that the fundamental constituents of the lamp, the particles it's made of, possess some incredibly simple rudimentary form of, let's call it proto-experience, almost zero complexity. Our complex human consciousness, then, is thought to be somehow built up or emerges from the combination of these countless tiny sparks of proto-experience in our brains.
Build up. Okay. But if everything has a tiny bit of this proto-consciousness, how do all those zillions of little bits in my brain combine to make my single unified experience of, being me right now, not just a chaotic mess of tiny feelings?
And that is the core challenge for panpsychism, the combination problem. It's a really tough one. Think about it. If you put 1 billion conscious humans in a giant stadium, you don't suddenly get one giant super consciousness hovering above them.
But you just get 1 billion separate experiences.
Right, exactly. So how do these supposed micro experiences, these tiny bits of proto-consciousness and particles, combine or bind together to form one unified macro consciousness like yours or mine? That's the big puzzle panpsychist theories are actively working on right now. How does combination happen? And finally, the fourth major view. Idealism. This one flips the script entirely. It asserts that reality itself is fundamentally mental or conscious. What we perceive as the physical world, the world of tables and chairs and planets, that's actually a manifestation or an appearance within consciousness. It's not the fundamental reality. Thinkers like Bishop George Berkeley is to be perceived way back, or more recently someone like Bernardo Kastrup championed this. Idealism basically dissolves the hard problem by reversing the assumed order of things, what philosophers call the ontology. It says consciousness isn't produced by matter. Rather, matter is what consciousness looks like or how it presents itself.
Okay, that's radical.
Yeah.
So instead of brain making mind, it's mind making brain and mind making the entire universe, basically.
Yeah.
But if the world is fundamentally mental, why does it feel so solid, so real, so objective? Why do we all seem to agree that this table is here and, why can't I just think really hard and make a pizza appear on it right now?
Exactly. You've nailed the main challenge for idealism, the problem of objectivity and solipsism. How does idealism explain the apparent stability, the lawfulness, the predictability of the world if it's all fundamentally mental? And how does it account for shared experience? If it's all just my consciousness, where do you fit in? Why do our experiences seem to align so well? It risks collapsing into solipsism, the idea that only my mind is sure to exist.
Phew. Okay, those are some seriously big, different ways of carving up reality. Materialism, dualism, panpsychism, idealism. But if even these grand philosophical frameworks struggle with the hard problem, where else can we look? Let's shift now to some specific modern scientific theories trying to crack this code. And then, maybe even more fascinatingly, let's look at those ancient wisdom traditions that have been exploring consciousness from the inside out for millennia. First up, a really bold scientific idea, orchestrated objective reduction, usually just called ORCHA-OR. This comes from the physicist Sir Roger Penrose and the anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff. And they suggest consciousness isn't just from neurons firing in the usual way. They think it arises from quantum processes happening deep inside tiny structures within neurons called microtubules.
Right, ORCHA is definitely ambitious, but when we look at it critically, it faces some major hurdles. The biggest scientific objection, the one that comes up again and again, is the decoherence problem. We touched on this earlier with quantum observation. The brain is, it's warm, it's wet, it's noisy, electrically and chemically incredibly busy.
Not ideal for quantum stuff.
Exactly. It seems like a terrible environment for maintaining the kind of delicate, large-scale quantum coherence that ORCHA requires. Physicists like Max Tegmark calculated that these quantum states in microtubules would likely decohere, basically get scrambled by the brain's environment almost instantly, far, far too quickly to be relevant for conscious thought, which happens on much slower timescales. And even if, hypothetically, they could overcome that physical problem, the philosophical objection still lingers. Okay, let's say there is a quantum collapse happening in a microtubule. Does ORCHA actually explain why that specific physical event should feel like redness or joy or the taste of chocolate?
The explanatory gap again.
Pretty much. It might propose a mechanism, but it doesn't necessarily bridge that gap to subjective experience. It doesn't automatically solve the hard problem.
Okay, so if quantum effects in brain tubes aren't the answer for many scientists, what else is cooking? There's another really ambitious scientific theory making waves and sparking quite a bit of controversy, actually. Integrated information theory, or IIT. What's unique about IIT is that it starts from the other end, almost. It begins with consciousness itself, with our experience. It identifies these 5 core properties or axioms of any experience, like it exists intrinsically, it's structured, it's specific, it's unified, it's definite. And from these axioms, IIT mathematically deduces that any system capable of consciousness must have a certain kind of internal cause-effect power. It must be able to affect itself in integrated ways. And it proposes a way to quantify this. Integrated information measured by a number called phi-O.
Right.
If a system has a phi value greater than 0, according to IIT, it possesses at least some degree of consciousness.
IoT definitely offers this really interesting, mathematically precise framework. It's attracted a lot of attention. But yeah, it's also highly controversial. One big reason is its implications, which lean towards panpsychism, as we discussed.
Because the math suggests that potentially many systems, not just brains, could have a non-zero phi, even relatively simple ones. The theory might imply that things like, say, a photodiode connected in a certain way, or even simple logic gates, could possess a tiny, tiny amount of consciousness, which for many people is just deeply counterintuitive.
Yeah, that sounds odd.
Then there are practical issues. Calculating phi for anything complex like a human brain, it's computationally intractable. We just can't do it currently. And critics have pointed out weird results where mathematically certain simple inactive grid structures could have astronomically high phi values, higher than a brain. That seems problematic. And this all culminated recently in that open letter you mentioned, signed by over 100 neuroscientists and philosophers. They raised serious concerns, questioning whether IIT is truly testable, whether it's falsifiable, and basically arguing it borders on pseudoscience because of its current structure.
Wow.
So it really highlights this fundamental question. What counts as a legitimate scientific theory of consciousness? It's a live debate. Okay, so these cutting-edge scientific models are grappling with it from the outside, looking at mechanisms, information, quantum effects. But, for thousands of years, there have been these other incredibly sophisticated traditions exploring consciousness directly from the inside. Let's turn now to the rigorous first-person insights from some of the Eastern contemplative traditions.
Yes, and this offers a completely different perspective, a different methodology almost. Take Buddhism, for instance. A central concept is anatta, often translated as not self. The idea, based on careful introspection, is that if you really look closely at your experience moment to moment, you can't find a permanent, unchanging, independent self or I in charge. What we usually call the self is seen more as a cognitive construct, a constantly changing process made up of these 5 aggregates like body, feelings, perceptions, mental habits, and consciousness itself. They're always in flux. And meditative practices like vipassana or insight meditation are essentially tools for empirically investigating this. They're methods for training the mind to observe its own workings with precision, aiming to directly perceive this impermanent, constructed nature of the self, to deconstruct that feeling of a solid observer. Now, in fascinating contrast, you have Advaita Vedanta, a major school of Hindu philosophy. It agrees that the egoic self, the personality we usually identify with, is ultimately an illusion. They call this Maya. But it posits that beneath or beyond that illusion, there exists a true eternal self called Atman. And this Atman is said to be identical with the ultimate reality, the universal consciousness called Brahman, often described as pure being, consciousness, and bliss, Sat Chidananda.
So a deeper self.
Exactly. The goal in Advaita is to realize this identity. Atman is Brahman. And a key concept here is the Sakshi, the witness consciousness, this pure, detached awareness that observes all the changing states of mind and body without getting entangled. The goal is to shift your identification from the changing thoughts and feelings to this unchanging witness. And then, briefly, look at Taoism from ancient China. Taoism often rejects a sharp mind-body split altogether. Mind and body are seen as just different aspects or manifestations of the vital life energy or flow. The ultimate principle is the Tao, this ineffable, natural way or principle of the universe. And the aim isn't so much to analyze consciousness, but to live in harmony with this Tao through Wu Wei.
Effortless action.
Right, effortless action or non-striving. It involves quieting that constantly churning, overworked mind, as they might say, and allowing life to unfold more naturally, aligning your personal consciousness with the greater flow of the Tao.
Okay, so Buddhism says no permanent self. Advaita says ultimate self is universal consciousness. Taoism says harmonize with the flow. Very different conclusions about the self, but is there maybe a shared thread in how they approach consciousness in the practice itself?
That's a great question. Yes, I think there is. Despite those vastly different philosophical destinations, all 3 traditions, in their own ways, seem to emphasize practices that cultivate a shift in perspective. A shift away from being totally identified with the contents of your experience, your thoughts, your feelings, your sensations, and towards an awareness of the context or the space in which those contents arise. This notion of witness consciousness or pure awareness keeps appearing, even if it's interpreted differently. And this brings us to what we could maybe call the trilemma of the observer. It's a neat way to summarize. You have the scientific observer, fundamentally a physical mechanistic system, maybe explained by neuroscience or IIT or something else. You have the Buddhist observer, ultimately an illusion, a fleeting process, something to be seen through via insight. And you have the Vedantic observer, the ultimate reality itself, a boundless universal witness consciousness.
Wow.
Three really distinct, and you could argue largely incompatible views of what that inner observer actually is. And they spring from radically different ways of knowing third-person science versus first-person introspection. They paint very different pictures of reality.
Man, this whole deep dive, it really forces you, doesn't it, to question your most basic assumptions about yourself and the world. I mean, whether this self you feel is just a complex pattern in your brain or an illusion you need to wake up from, or maybe even a little piece of universal consciousness. Each of those answers has just huge implications, right? For how we live, for ideas like free will, for ethics, for everything. Think about the kind of universe each view suggests. Materialism gives us a universe that's fundamentally non-conscious, where experiences may be a lucky accident.
Right.
Panpsychism kind of re-enchants the world, suggesting experience is woven into the very fabric of reality. And idealism turns everything on its head, suggesting reality is consciousness and maybe exploring our own mind as a way of exploring the cosmos itself. So where does this leave us? What's the future look like for actually figuring this out?
Well, one crucial thing to keep in mind is a limitation we bumped into earlier, the correlation versus causation issue in science. Science is incredibly powerful at finding correlations, right? This brain activity happens when that subjective experience is reported, neural correlates of consciousness. But it fundamentally struggles to explain why that physical activity should be or cause the subjective feeling itself. It can't easily cross that explanatory gap from physical facts to phenomenal facts. It's kind of the ultimate problem of induction applied to consciousness. So where do we go? One promising direction might be these hybrid approaches, things like contemplative neuroscience. This tries to seriously combine objective third-person methods like brain imaging, fMRI, EEG, with rigorous, detailed first-person reports from people highly trained in introspection, like long-term meditators. The hope is that by carefully correlating these two streams of data, the objective and the subjective, maybe we can start to build better models and bridge that gap, or at least understand its contours better.
So in the end, maybe the hard problem of consciousness isn't like a single puzzle box we just need to find the key for. Maybe it's more like, I don't know, a tangled Gordian knot, woven from threads of science, philosophy, and direct personal experience. Will some future scientific breakthrough finally untie it? A new physics, a better neuroscience? Or will we eventually have to admit it's just beyond us? A fundamental limit of how human minds can understand the world, that's a view called Mysterianism. Or could the knot be dissolved, not by solving it, but through a radical shift in perspective, like some of these contemplative traditions suggest? By changing the nature of the observer, asking the question, that's definitely something for you to mull over, maybe during your next quiet moment, just noticing your own awareness. Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive into consciousness.